Efforts are well underway to combat desertification in Africa. In the Sahara region, a strip of land bordering the Sahara Desert runs 3,670 miles from the east of the continent to the west. 135 million people who live here are at extreme risk of poverty and displacement. And efforts to halt the desert through the Great Green Wall of Africa have been underway since 2007. But is it working? And if not, what will save Africa from the onslaught of the desert? Here at Live Curious, we share stories of rewilding, of how people, nature and all life can work together toward a better future. So what is desertification? Desertification is an enemy to rewilding. It's actually like an arch nemesis, actually to all life on this earth. Its definition is quite literally the process by which fertile land becomes desert. Now it's worth mentioning that it is a natural process and deserts are a vital part of Earth's systems. But as we'll find out, it's humans which are inducing and accelerating desertification. Without fertile land, plants can't grow. It's not only really bad for biodiversity, it's catastrophic to communities who live within it, and terrifyingly, it's a positive feedback loop that scientists fear will spiral the climate crisis out of control. And the worst part is that it's happening all over the world. The Borgen project found that 36 million square miles of the entire globe is affected by desertification. But a place where its impacts have been so severe is on the continent of Africa. Africa is home to the world's largest, hottest desert, the Sahara. It's over 3.6 million square miles and it's getting bigger. And the Sahara has expanded south into the Sahel by 10% over the course of the last century. And if current rates of desertification continue, all of these people will be under threat and displaced. So why is desertification happening in Africa? In recent history, the circumstances in this part of Africa have been the perfect cocktail for intense desertification. And the ingredients to this horrendous cocktail include unsustainable agriculture and forestry practices, a rising population and its sprawl, climate-driven factors such as droughts, heat waves, strong winds, and climate change in general. But just to focus on these unsustainable land practices because they are the core drivers of human-induced desertification. The other factors like the rising population, they just accelerate the need for natural resources and therefore the unsustainable practices. It starts with clearing the land of trees and vegetation. Trees that have a low value in commodity and provision, which is almost all of them in comparison to crop yields. This reduces the soil structure and then coupled with wind erosion, the topsoil is blown away and then you're left with the desert-like sand. And then if you add pressures from grazing livestock and over farming and a prolonged drought, you have the perfect recipe for intense desertification. Even when it does rain, there's no plants to absorb that rainfall in the soil and the water just rushes off and leads to more erosion. And for biodiversity, well, desertification is all-consuming. Without plants, trees, grasses, the primary producers, little else life can survive. It pushes already critically low species to extinction and threatens the population and dispersal of all other life. And for people, the communities that are living in these areas, desertification leads to poverty. Food production decreases, water sources dry up, and populations are forced to move to more hospitable areas, putting increased pressures elsewhere. And for the planet, well, as we've touched on already, desertification accelerates the damaging effects of climate change, of global climate change, which in the long term, no one is safe from. But right now, it's the people in the Sahel that are living with these difficulties against desertification. Something has to give, right? There has to be some solutions. And yes, I'm happy to say that there are some solutions, which we're going to go through now. And the first place that we have to start is by talking about Africa's Great Green Wall. It's an African-led initiative that seeks to put a halt to desertification in the Sahel by mostly planting a wall of trees. A wall of trees that is 4,350 miles long and 10 miles wide. The aim and hopes is that the trees will create a buffer that is resilient to the strong winds and that is able to retain moisture and ultimately halt the progression of the Sahara Desert. It began in 2007 and was estimated to cost $8 billion and was aimed to be finished by 2030. Now, in 2022, it's 15 years in, and with less than 8 years remaining, how is the project faring? Well, the short answer is that it's failing. At least in the initial idea of planting the Green Wall is failing. The Great Green Wall's website stated it's not even 15% complete yet, with results from each country varying massively due to different geographies, economic development and levels of governance and management. Countries like Ethiopia and Senegal have made considerable progress, while countries like Cameroon and Ghana have only recently got started. And the project has also been heavily criticised with planting trees without much forethought to their aftercare. and many have in fact died. So if the Great Green Wall is failing, is there any hope? Has there been any success? Well, yes, I'm happy to tell you that there has been some success. But before we dive into that, the Great Green Wall is not a failure. Maybe in the sense of not reaching its ambitious goals, but even then, in the face of climate change, ambitious goals are required. But it's not a failure because it's helped engineer or bring to light a productive system for managing the land. And as we seem to be finding out with almost every video here on Leave Curious, the answer to ecosystem recovery lies with the local communities. As we know, the people of the Sahara region rely heavily upon the land for natural resources, for food, fuel, and to make money. In many places, these agricultural practices have been unsustainable. Trees have been cleared to grow crops, trees have been cleared to rear livestock. Now, this may generate short-term gains for landowners, but in 5 to 10 years' time, with harsh climate conditions and unsustainable practices, the land becomes degraded. But the essence of what's working now, that's enabling the landscape to recover, that's enabling the local communities to produce enough food for not only themselves, but to go on to sell and for biodiversity to flourish. It's happening through the assisted natural regeneration of trees, ANR. Specifically in the Sahel, these success techniques are a little different to ANR. Instead, they've become widely known as FMNR, Farmer Managed Natural Regeneration. And it works like this. So where there are trees attempting to grow naturally but are struggling, quite often these are trees that previously fell down to the stump. FMNR is being used to nurture these naturally present trees to become established and fruit-bearing, seed-bearing, soil-strengthening trees. As one grows, it helps to provide conditions for another tree to grow and for crops and other plants to grow beneath them. And the techniques of this process are very simple. A process of retaining the strongest and straightest stems of the tree with proper pruning to harvest the other stems, maintaining the vitality of the tree while providing communities with resources and the ecosystem with the much needed resilience required against climate change. So the process really begins by identifying trees that are attempting to grow from the ground. And on the surface they look like little bushes, but below ground the root systems are still established and intact. And because of these established root systems, FMNR has a much higher success rate than planting trees. And it's also a fraction of the cost. It was Australian forest maker Tony Ronaldo who pioneered the technique after many decades working in Africa. Identifying that deforestation was the problem, he thought, well, let's just plant trees. And they nearly all died. His endeavours to find a way led to the technique of nurturing previously felled trees back to life. FMNR has been immensely successful throughout Niger and Malawi, providing for local people and answering the threats of desertification. But if this is the answer, why aren't we seeing it widespread across Africa? Well, for starters, in many countries there are often disputes and contentions over who owns the land and what trees. And in some countries and in some regions, the government still need to grant permission in order to work with the trees. There's also just a hell of a lot of land to cover and different communities and people to meet and to educate and unique problems to solve. And sadly, many areas are still desperate and practicing unsustainable techniques to get those short-term gains. So I read one article where Kenyan FMNR champion Irene Ojoku, I hope I said that name right, really sorry if I didn't. She stated that the government of Kenya are not giving it serious attention. And this is likely to be happening in other regions, in other countries of the Sahel, where the government and the management isn't as strong as Kenya's. In my mind, it would make sense to shift all of the remaining budget for the Great Green Wall to plant trees into promoting and spreading the word of FMNR. I think in 2021, like another injection of I think it was something crazy like $11 billion was put into the project. Look, it's not an easy task, but this form of holistic management gives us hope. And if you want to be inspired by some more rewilding stories from the UK, you can check out the video that's on the screen now. But in the meantime, thanks for watching. Leave Curious.